All right, we're going to get rolling.
They helped create an economy that was completely addicted to cheap money.
You need to buy savings bonds or something. You need to be way, way, way out of this space.
I subscribe to Miss Piggy's rule of money management. Always manage to have more money, you know what I mean?
It wasn't but 2 years ago that everybody was saying China's economy was going to be bigger than that of the United States. It's gone in the exact opposite direction.
So we're going to jump right in.
Okay, welcome to This Week in Mining, where we talk about making money in the metals and mining sector. My name is Jay Martin. I'm your host, and my guest today is Jp Cortez, the Executive Director of the Sound Money Defense League. JP, it's great to have you on the show, man. Good to see you.
Jay, it's good to see you again, man. Thank you for having me on.
Pleasure's all mine. Okay, so here's where I want to start. You're not going to be surprised to hear that for the last 10 years, either on my stage, at my conferences, or here on the podcast, we constantly return to the concept of gold as money. But most of the time, this is presented by my guest as like a theoretical dream that one day maybe. Rarely ever is it backed up by any material developments or evidence that there are trends moving that direction. But this is exactly what you work on. And so I'd love you to make a case for me right now, and then I'll just pull on some threads. We'll use this as a jump off point. What is the case for people to believe there is some sort of a return to a hard money standard occurring right now in the United States?
I am incredibly bullish on this idea. And frankly, there are a ton of legislative wins to support it. This is the 10th year. The Sound Money Defense League has been in operation now for 10 years, where we've been advocating for the remonetization of gold and silver. The truth is that right now, gold and silver are currently unworkable as money. And the primary reason for that is the taxes that surround its use for people buying, for people selling. There's too much friction involved that make gold and silver unworkable as money. And so the Sound Money Defense League for a decade now has been going state to state and to Washington, D.C., removing all of these disincentives, removing all of the impediments that stand in the way to people actually getting to use gold and silver. And so these kind of legislative victories are massively important, because this is what allows for individuals to adopt their own personal gold standard. This is what introduces competition to the US dollar. This is what allows for innovation in money, which is ultimately what we want. We want the best money, right? Here in the United States, no one woke up this morning and said, I think I'm going to choose the US dollar today because I believe that this has the best monetary properties that a money could have. No one had that conversation with themselves when they woke up. The truth is that we use the dollar because we're trapped. All of the alternatives are shackled with taxes and disincentives. And so you don't really have a choice but to choose the dollar. On top of that, obviously, taxes are payable in US dollars. And so there are a bunch of things that are regulatorily funneling people, trapping people into using the US dollar, not giving them any other choice. And to that end, we're going around allowing people to use gold and silver as money if they want to remove the taxes that would impede you from buying gold and silver in some states here in the United States. And I believe in Canada, if I'm understanding correctly, there are instances where when you buy gold or silver, coins, rounds, bullion, you're going to get hit with a sales tax on the purchase of those items. The same is also true on the back end in many states, and on the federal level, when you sell, if you enjoy a gain, the state and the feds are going to tax you on that, even though in many cases, you're just talking about a nominal gain. So the removal of these kind of taxes, we've found, has been the biggest single thing that can be done to readopting or to reintroducing gold and silver as money.
So let me ask you, JP, and adding some detail to this, if I've got it correct, 45 states have now removed sales tax to buying gold and silver, and 13 states have now removed capital gains tax on owning gold and silver. And this is largely a consequence of the work that you and your team are doing. Are those numbers correct? And then my question here is, so by removing these barriers, people can choose to transact in gold and silver, in your words, if they want to, which is the point. What's the advantage? You know, I could share some stories about the positive role that gold has played in my wealth picture. And I adopted this directly from a mutual friend of ours, Rick Rule, who told me a decade ago, become your own central bank, and then outlined the blueprint on how to do that, which began with owning physical gold and taking possession of it, and then building your wealth portfolio off of that bedrock. So what's the advantage, JP, for individuals what's the advantage of transacting, owning, and freely owning gold and silver?
You are correct about those numbers. At this point, 45 states have eliminated the sales tax on the purchase of the metals, which tells us that only 5 states remain in the entire country that still levy this outdated tax. Of those 5 states, 4 of them are currently actively considering legislation to end this tax as well. So even the stragglers are starting to fall in line with what we know to be good policy. On the capital gains side, you're right. As of just a few months ago in Nebraska and Alabama, we penned 2 more states earlier this year to end this tax, bringing the total to 13 states that don't charge this capital gains tax.
You know what? Could you do me a favor? What's the timeline that these taxes have been removed? And that would give us a sense of like, you know, is this a movement that's heating up? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So just this year in 2024, we've had the most successful legislative season that we've ever had. And we have 7 legislative wins across the country to show for that. Last year in 2023, there were 5 legislative wins. So in the last 2 years, 12 states have actively passed legislation to do this. In the prior years, there were also several legislative wins on those fronts as well. And that's not even getting into the federal legislation, right? We have congressmen here in the United States that even on the federal level, while they haven't passed any federal legislation has been introduced to audit America's gold reserves, to eliminate the federal capital gains tax on gold and silver, to call for a full accounting of all of America's gold, any encumbrances that might be placed on it, any trades, swaps, leases, anything that might be encumbering the gold. This would call for a full accounting of that. So legislatively, on the state level and on the federal level, we're seeing politicians actively making it easier for people to use gold and silver as money. But it's not just people. It's the states themselves as well. In some cases, we're seeing legislation passed to empower state treasurers to invest state funds in physical gold and silver held within the state. Just a few months ago in Utah, we were working with legislators there who just approved legislation that would allow for $180 million of state investment into physical gold, the first tranche of which will be purchased here soon. And we're working with these same legislators to further protect the rights of people using gold and silver as money in the state of Utah. So there's a lot of promise on the legislative side. There are a lot of reasons to be really excited about people being able to use gold and silver as money, institutions and governments themselves using gold and silver as money. And I think to your question, you asked the question earlier about like how does the normal person benefit? You know, and I think you make a really interesting point, because using gold and silver as your everyday money is not necessarily the point. You've got Gresham's law, which says that bad money will push out good money. And so the truth is, in many cases, people don't necessarily want to spend their gold and silver. They have Federal Reserve notes that they can spend. So there's no point in spending your good money if I'm allowed to use this bad money. And I think that the innovators in this space, the people working on digital gold or fractional gold or things like this is an uphill battle that they're going to have to combat, because there's a real argument as to why maybe people wouldn't want to necessarily use gold and silver as money. But you can look at it from other angles. For example, reintroduction of things like gold clause contracts with the remonetization of gold and silver. Historically in the United States, gold clause contracts were very common. If you and I were needing to if you and I were entering a financial agreement over the course of 30 years, 50 years, 100 years, we want to be sure that the money that the contract will be payable in will have retained its value through the life of the contract. Okay. In the case of using the dollar, if you and I make a 30-year contract, a 50-year contract, I don't necessarily know. As the lender, you're taking on enormous risk, potentially getting paid back in massively devalued dollars. So gold clause contracts, for example, are something that were very common in the United States in the infancy of the country in the 17 and 1800s, before the United States government ultimately made them illegal and made it illegal to privately own gold. This is one of the ways contractually that individuals can benefit from gold and silver being money again.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I've inadvertently entered into a gold clause contract. I didn't know that term until you just mentioned it. But as you explained it, we structured a debt deal 4 years ago where debt was paid in cash, repayment was paid in gold coins, American Eagle specifically, for a handful of reasons, but mainly to replenish the central bank of J. Martin, as we discussed at the beginning here, which is like sort of the lifelong goal. But I find myself in that camp where I don't really feel any desire or call to transact in gold, but there's tremendous power in literally being your own central bank. And I've actioned this and told this story to my newsletter subscribers a couple times, where coming up on a real estate transaction a couple of years ago, I closed on a deal far quicker than I anticipated. And I wasn't liquid enough to close on a deal that I ended up getting very favorable terms on. Essentially, I made a lowball offer on a condo I wanted to purchase. It closed the day, the offer was accepted the day that I made the offer, which was far faster than I anticipated. I was squeezed on liquidity. So I wrote myself a promissory note. I borrowed gold from my safe to bridge and close on this condo. Debt had to be repaid in gold coins with a fee of gold coins back to the Bank of J. Now, completely arbitrary. I didn't have to pay myself the loan back. There would be no recourse if I didn't. But the exercise of operating this way was tremendously empowering. And just as an aside, okay, so I want to dive in. No.
And I think you kind of hit on an important point there, that so going through the motions and procedurally doing that is incredibly empowering. And you kind of, you realize the gravity, the longevity of sound money and why it's important, and how that is such an important condition to a successful country's money, right? Being able to make long-term plans, being able to allocate wealth, to take on different projects, to increase or to better infrastructure. All of those things it is a necessary condition to be able to plan that you'll have good money, stable money, decades into the future. I think legislatively, as far as the gold clause contracts go, what we're seeing is that we're having to actively pass legislation in many cases that call for specific performance of the contract. So if the contract says, Jp Cortez and J. Martin are entering into this contract to be paid 50 years from now in 100 gold eagles, that contract would have to be repaid in these 100 gold eagles. And if not for the legislation calling for specific performance on these contracts, a judge could take this contract and say, okay, I'm going to rule in favor of Jp Cortez, but he doesn't have to pay using these American eagles.
Right.
Gold, or the US dollar are legal tender. These are reasonable substitutes. No, you will be paid in the dollar. But for people who understand sound money and understand gold and silver in these markets, we know that the difference between 100 gold eagles and the US dollar value of those 100 gold eagles, these are not the same thing. They do not carry the same purchasing power. They do not carry the same longevity. And so contractually, legislatively, we're also protecting the rights of people to be able to be paid in what is contractually obligated.
One of the most underestimated values of owning physical, I find, JP, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, but there's a distinct psychological advantage that you gain. And it goes back, you ever seen The Gambler with John Goodman and Mark Wahlberg? They're sitting at this smoky table having a conversation, and Wahlberg's sort of a destitute gambler, and he says, at one point I was up $2 million, and Goodman says, how much of it's left? He says, none. And then he goes on this tangent describing the concept of fuck you money. He says, and this is the money that's sort of put away, putting you in the position where you can always choose to do nothing. You can always choose to walk away from a deal because you've got your insurance policy in your back pocket, right? That's the FU money that Goodman refers to. And that is exactly the role many times that physical has played in my life. It's that back pocket insurance policy that I hope to never use. It really doesn't do anything for me on a week over week, year over year basis, but it's always there just in case. It's retained its purchasing power. And I actually, this is sort of corny, but I attribute it to the same as like, when I was young, I used to get beat up a lot. For some reason, I had a target on my back when I was like a young teenager. And my mom put me in boxing, right? She taught, and I learned how to fight. And I never became an aggressive person, but I gained a ton of confidence because suddenly I learned like actually fighting is just like any sport. You get better at it if you train, right? Turns out I was tougher than I thought I was. But it gave me this new option when confronted by some jerk. I could now sit back and do nothing. I knew I was probably going to be fine. So I was no longer reacting out of fear, short-term thinking, quickly doing something to get out of a trouble spot that I would later regret. I had this new option in my back pocket. I knew I could handle myself, so I'm just going to let this play out. I can do nothing, and I'm going to be fine, right? And if it escalates, I'll be okay there, but it's probably not going to if I do nothing, right? And that's the role that gold plays when markets crash and everybody else is panic buying, panic selling. You have the option to sit back and do nothing, right? And wait for the opportunity and then strike on your timing.
And I completely agree. And it's the confidence to be able to do that, to know that you don't necessarily have to make a move. You're not necessarily pinched or forced one way or the other. And I think that that speaks to the importance of counterparty risk and reduction of counterparty risk, right? We have these portfolios. In many cases, states have these portfolios that are full of third world debt and CDs and mutual funds without owning a single ounce of gold, because these revenue profit chasers are not giving any consideration to the importance of reducing counterparty risk. They're just chasing returns. And if that's your only consideration, if chasing returns is your only consideration, I understand why gold and silver might not necessarily seem sexy to you, right? You're not going to collect trading fees on it. There is no yield, quote unquote, as they say. But if you're worried about, or if you're concerned about at all, counterparty risk or risk of initial investment, right? Gold and silver is such an empowering asset, a tool in your toolbox that plays a different role many times than some of these other assets that we've talked about. And like states themselves, working with states that are starting to reconsider the way their portfolios are set up and the investments that states themselves are making in, and on this front, there's a lot of progress happening here too, right? Famously, the Texas owned $1 billion worth of physical gold, which was actually the reason why they famously built that Texas bullion depository many years ago. The state of Ohio has invested about $1 billion into their police and firefighter pension funds. Like I mentioned earlier, the state of Utah is getting ready to buy its first tranche of $180 million worth of physical gold stored nearby in their state. So, it's not just individuals. It's not just these gold bugs. It's institutions themselves and governments themselves that are waking up to the notion that while Federal Reserve and dollar debasement is largely the product of actions by the federal government and the Federal Reserve, states themselves can be empowered to protect themselves, to enable themselves to invest in gold and silver, and obviously to protect the well-being of the citizens of their state. And, additionally, it's not just the United States. I actually was recently speaking to someone in Canada who is interested in working with their provincial government to allow them to invest state funds or province funds,
Provincial funds,
in physical gold, right? So this is something that's taking hold against a backdrop of what's happening in Zimbabwe, and against backdrops of BRICS currencies and these innovations in money that are happening. States themselves are saying, wait, hang on. All of these central banks around the world, gold is good enough for them. Maybe it should be good enough for us too.
I got to ask which province this was. Was it Alberta?
I'm actually not, I am not allowed to say, but you might be onto something.
Yeah. Well, Alberta signed the Alberta Sovereignty Act, or put this piece of legislation forward maybe 24 months ago. And then Saskatchewan followed up with the Saskatchewan First Act. And the media vilified these pieces of legislature as like separation acts or and they weren't that at all. It was just the provinces demanding their constitutional rights back and to remove federal creep into their provincial decisions. Real quick break here, guys. If you are a mining investor, you are without question familiar with the Golden Triangle region in British Columbia. This is one of the most prolific mining regions in the world due to its vast deposits of gold, silver, and copper. Now, for the last 4 years, Dolly Varden Silver has been busy expanding their high-grade silver deposit in the Triangle, and they are backed by some of the smartest investors in the silver business, including the legendary Eric Sprott, Hecla Mining, US Global Investors, Fidelity, Delbrook Capital, Sprott Resource Corp, and more. If you are curious why the smartest money in the silver business is cozying up to Dolly Varden Silver, then hit the link beneath this video. I'm really curious about something. You talked about states, specifically Utah. The treasurer is on plan to purchase $180 million of gold, if I understood that correctly. How many states, JP, do you know how many states own physical gold as part of their treasury right now?
Currently, at this moment, Ohio is the only one that has gold on its balance sheet, to my knowledge.
Okay.
Like I mentioned, Texas recently divested from a position that it held. The reason Texas held about $1 billion, they stored it in New York in the COMEX. They built the Texas Bullion Depository with the hope that that bullion depository would get COMEX approval. And then instead of paying for storage fees out to a bank in New York, they could bring the gold itself home. I think ultimately they decided not to do that. But yeah, Texas is one famously that for the last 12 years or so has been pushing this forward as far as state investment in precious metals. And there are, so those are the three, Texas, Ohio, and Utah. But those are just the ones that have already done. Oh, excuse me, Tennessee as well passed legislation this year empowering their state treasurer to invest funds in gold and silver and conducting studies to establish an in-state bullion depository and various things like that. So, and those are just the ones that have actually passed the legislation. There are also states that have considered legislation like this that maybe it hasn't passed, but with the passage of time and with support continuing to come, because so long as you believe that the dollar will continue to be devalued, gold and silver are a pretty safe bet. So over time, these arguments become on their face even more obvious. And that has been our experience across the country. And I think, especially now with gold being, 2,400, upwards of 2,400, you're seeing, I'm hearing from people, elected officials in these states saying, oh my gosh, we passed legislation. We haven't made our first gold purchase yet. Look at how much we've lost in this time. Or, wow, when you were coming and advocating for this policy, gold was at $1,800. And you were telling people, you were making the arguments about how, between COVID spending and just general deficit spending of the United States, inflation is going to harm the dollar. The dollar is going to lose its purchasing power, and gold and silver are going to win out. And now here we are, a couple of years, and 35% increase in the price of gold in that time. So it's not, just individuals. It's states themselves are very much waking up to this because they realize that, the status quo that is America's monetary system is unstable at very best.
Yeah, that's such an interesting trend if that picks up, states continuing to add gold to their treasury, because you always have to ask the question why. And you can say, well, central banks around the world have been doing that in a record number for the last 24 months, setting 50-year records at their gold acquisition pace. I think the reports of them dumping US dollars are overblown, but what I do believe is that they are de-risking. I mean, that's when you diversify your assets like that, you are just de-risking from something. And it would be very obvious to anybody who pays attention what they're de-risking from, and just building an optionality, right? Which is what gold provides, because it's the only asset that's not someone else's liability. It's globally liquid. It's all of these things. It's the lifeboat.
It's a stateless money. Right?
It's a stateless money.
It's a money without a ruler.
Okay, so right there. Now, what if American states began to do this in greater number? what would the message there be? And what would that be a signal of, I wonder? Do you think about that? Because when these things happen, I always like to say, this is not an event. So Utah is going to add $100 million worth of gold to its treasury. That's not a standalone event. It's probably part of a trajectory. Now, what is the trajectory? What is the shift that's happening? And so could you extrapolate and say, we'll probably see more of this at a state level? And if we do, let's read between the lines here. Here's what that means.
I think it is perfectly reasonable to consider that this trend that is happening in the United States on the state level, that's actually started in Utah back in 2011. The original sound money bill that passed on the state level happened in Utah. I guess that's 13 years ago now. It is perfectly reasonable to believe that this trend will continue because the momentum is so obviously on the side of pro-sound money legislation here. Be it the removal of sales taxes or capital gains taxes or commercial activity taxes on dealers, be it legislation that reaffirms gold and silver as legal tender or establishes an in-state depository or empowers a state treasurer. All of these things, all of these legislative notches that we're winning along the way, I think ultimately the end goal here is a reestablishment of, more than anything, just an individual's gold standard. I've been asked questions about like a national gold standard, or, how would Congress or the Federal Reserve, if they were to reinstate a gold standard, how would that look? And I think that question kind of misses the point. Gold and silver are permissionless money, and they don't have that counterparty risk. They're no one else's liability, like you said. And so the entire value of gold and silver is not that there's this giant federal infrastructure that creates this system of money. Gold and silver are money. They have been for thousands of years. And nothing like, for example, legal tender status, which is just a glorified stamp of approval by a government declaring what is and isn't money. Nothing like that ultimately determines what is and isn't money, right? Because gold and silver and sound money, money as we know it, is chosen by the marketplace. It's not handed down by edict or by executive order. These are monies that have withstood the test of time, holding their purchasing power through that process. So if you believe that the American government will continue its conquest, its ways of empire, expanding militarily, continuing to debase the dollar with spending internationally and domestically, if that is your long-term thesis, then gold and silver as money are almost the obvious conclusion to this. And so I think states, because states are made up of individuals, they're almost, it's self-preservation. The first state that ends up establishing a strategic gold reserve in a meaningful way is going to benefit from that. So for example, like I mentioned, Ohio has about $1 billion in its police and fire pension fund. American pension funds across the country are massively underfunded. We're headed towards a pension cliff here in the States. And a lot of that has to do with this incredible forecasting where these people, these revenue chasers, profit chasers, are swearing that they'll give you 7, 8, 9, 10% a year in return. And that's how they're running their calculations. And so they just have, it's not based in any sort of reality. It's the opportunity for that is so slim. And so we have this pension issue that's happening here in the States, and it's going to get worse. And the states that are best prepared to insulate themselves from this damage wrought by the federal spending in many cases are the ones that are going to come out on top. These are going to be states like Texas. These are going to be states like Utah that have the insulation to protect themselves from the debasement of the dollar. And that, kind of like you mentioned earlier, these are states that are reclaiming their constitutional rights. As the United States Constitution prescribes, gold and silver are the only thing. No state shall make anything but gold and silver a tender in the payment of debt. So constitutionally, the framework of the United States is one based in gold and silver. So I think when you're talking about long term, what we're going to see here, I think it probably gets worse before it gets better, I'm sad to say. American politicians are going to make sure of that. It's going to be a difficult time. I think inflation is going to kick again at a time where homes, medicine, food, basic necessities are becoming harder and harder to afford for so many Americans and so many people around the world. And unfortunately, I think that's going to get worse because the people who have the monetary or the people who have the monopoly on America's monetary powers are going to fight like hell to keep it. And we're already seeing the effects of that, right? These aren't people who are taking looks inward and saying, wow, maybe we shouldn't print all this money. These are people that are saying, no, this is Putin's fault. Or no, this is the fault of the of the CEO of your local grocery store. Yeah. And so this sleight of hand and this manipulation and blame game will continue. And so unfortunately, I think that on a national level, on a global level, even the monetary condition of the world is in pretty dire shape. And that's why it's so important that on an individual level and on an entrepreneurial level, the roadblocks keeping smart investors, smart entrepreneurs that could otherwise build and innovate within this space, that could build monies that could withstand government overreach or government debasement. Those are the people that need to be empowered to create within money. And as far as the Sound Money Defense League goes, removing those disincentives and removing all of the roadblocks in the way of people being able to do that is ultimately the biggest thing that I believe that we can do.
No doubt. No doubt. I mean, you can see the citizens. Let's stick with the U.S. for a minute here, but you could parallel this conversation in 5 or 6 other countries. The citizens and the states within which they live are becoming more and more disenfranchised with the federal leadership. And this is, I mean, obviously that's the case. And what that causes, I believe, is somebody to ask, well, what else can we do? Right? I don't like the direction that things are going. What else can I do? I mean, I asked this question. I'm in Canada, but my wife's American and my kids have dual. So we have that optionality. We're also putting down roots in Southeast Asia for the last couple of years. We're heading back there in February. We're building optionality from a geographic standpoint into our life because I don't like the direction things are going. So I say, well, what else can we do? Right. And we come up with these other ideas. Right. For us, it might be as simple as moving to Texas or Idaho, Arizona, a few of the states that we like. My wife is from Texas. Or maybe it's a bit more of a move over to Indonesia, for example. But states are asking the same question, what else can we do, right? And you're seeing it in the leadership, right? Wasn't this the case recently in Texas when Governor Abbott structured his own fencing across the border to put up a barrier to the illegal immigration problem? And the Supreme Court ordered him to take it down, and he just said no. There's a state governor in direct defiance of a Supreme Court order. I mean, this is exactly it. I don't like the direction things are going. I'm going to do it my way, right? And again, it's like that happened, but it wasn't a standalone event. It's always part of a trend, always part of a trend. And this relates, does it not?
Absolutely, because what you just described embodies the American spirit, right? That is constitutional. What you just described, where a state looked at the federal government and the federal government said, this is the law, and the state said, no, it's not. You. Yeah, right. That is the entire American experience boiled down into one moment, right? And so we're seeing money is sort of similar in that way, where, you know, in 1913 and in 1933, money has largely died here in the United States. The gold standard died, and maybe more so than died, it was killed. Right? Because the gold standard is disliked by dishonest politicians who don't like honest money. So to be sure, there's a difference between something dying and something being killed. And the gold standard was killed. And the reason they did that was to enable all of this, to enable this massive increase in the existence and the reach of the government, to enable the ability to fight and fund conquests of blood around the world in places many Americans couldn't even find on a map. The whole thing was to empower the central unit, which is what the United States Constitution was intentionally fighting against, right? And so after, 1913, when the Federal Reserve is established, 1933, when America criminalizes gold ownership. So you're talking now 91 years ago that gold as money is completely removed from the American zeitgeist, where, you know, there is no real concept of gold and silver as money here in the States. And that's true certainly across younger demographics, around people our age. There is no concept of gold and silver as money. These are just pieces of paper that we carry around on our wallets without any real consideration for where do these derive their value? Why do we use these pieces of paper? Those questions aren't asked. And so as far as the Sound Money Defense League is concerned, going state to state and having these conversations with legislators. I've said before, there are more than 8,000 elected legislators at the state level here in the United States, the vast majority of which have never even considered, have never heard the term sound money, have never really asked themselves any of these questions. So, you know, having a direct line to the people who are ostensibly making the decisions that affect us all is a very powerful thing that we're doing here. And I think one of the big things that make this work is the grassroots pressure. I think I mentioned off camera we work closely with Money Metals Exchange, as a national precious metals dealer. And one of the reasons that these legislative projects that we've been so successful at for the last decade is because we've been able to leverage this customer list that Money Metals Exchange has of empowered, people who care very much about this issue, whether or not they're being charged a sales tax by their state when they buy gold and silver is an issue that directly affects them as someone who actively buys precious metals. So being able to leverage the grassroots power, and that in itself is such a powerful tool here in the United States that I can't overstate, right? Because if you call DC, if you're calling, your congressman in Washington, an intern is going to answer your call. They might pass your message along. Your congressman might send you back a form email, but that's not true in the States. At least, here in the United States, when you're calling state capitals, when you're in Nashville or you're in Lincoln, Nebraska or Jackson, Mississippi, in those places, individuals still have power and they can still call and email and talk to their elected legislators and make their voice heard in a way that's not necessarily true on the federal level. Right. So, and I think that that's one of the big things that I like to tell people when they ask, how can I get involved? What can we do? Man, the biggest thing that anyone can do is to simply be an active participant in their state legislature, because even as a lost cause as the federal level in the United States is, as gridlocked as it is, change doesn't happen there, but change still happens in your own state government, in your own local government. And I think that that's, one of the largest things that the principles of sound money and kind of readopting all of this can teach us. We don't have to solve the problem that's happening thousands of miles away in an unknown land called Washington, D.C. Those are deeply unserious people. If they want to play dress up and, pontificate and beat their chest so that they have Instagram and TikTok content, fine. Let them. But in our local communities, what we can do, we can establish our own personal gold standards. We can establish businesses that accept and transact in gold and silver. We can make sure that the institutions that protect us or that ostensibly keep us in mind are protecting themselves with allocations to physical gold. So I think that is such an important part of the American experience. The federal level was never supposed to be this big. It was never supposed to be this powerful. And so the states themselves, rightfully so, are kicking back on that. And that was the whole point of the 10th Amendment. That was the whole point of why the U.S. Constitution was written the way that it was. Sound money as a constitutional practice. It was Mises who wrote that sound money should be among in the United States the Bill of Rights, in a civilian's Bill of Rights. A stable money is just as important as your freedom to assemble and your freedom of speech and your freedom to own firearms. This is a necessary component to a productive and a flourishing country.
I love that, man. And I love the passion, by the way, JP. And I do see a return psychologically to sound money, if only because I see a return to simplicity. And I see this all around me. And this may materialize as people just thinking more critically about their food supply. I see this real common, and people are gravitating towards sources closer to home, whole foods, cleaner ingredients, not just blind faith. And if the FDA says it's okay, I guess it's fine with me. It's like, there's like 12,000 chemicals that are FDA approved. They're terrible for you. And the health crisis we're seeing in response to that, among a handful of other things, but it's very real. And I'm seeing folks simplify their life in a variety of ways, leaving cities, moving to more rural areas. I mean, we did that. My small family did that. We left a metropolis of 4 million to a town of 20,000, right, to simplify. And gold is the simplification of wealth, right? It's the base layer, right? It's a very similar philosophy, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's such an interesting point. And I had a similar conversation with someone recently where they called it nihilism. We're seeing the effects of political nihilism and sort of a more return to traditional values, like going out and living in the woods and doing these things. And I think I wouldn't call it nihilism, but I think it's so important to point out that people are doing this because they no longer trust the authority. And that didn't happen by accident.
Right.
To the extent that people don't trust their government anymore, that is 1,000% the fault of the people who lied and manipulated and cheated and stole from its citizenry until they turned their backs and realized that the authority could no longer be trusted.
Yeah.
Right. So if we had a government that could be trusted, we wouldn't need gold and silver. We wouldn't need regulatory or roadblocks on a money that a government might otherwise spend or recklessly. You
know my thoughts on that, man. It's like, I agree with you, and simultaneously I feel myself thinking, but it's unreasonable to have that level of trust in any organization. And I use the FDA example again. It's like, it's the blanket sort of litmus test that most people use to determine if a food product or a drug is safe. There are literally hundreds of thousands of ingredients that are governed by the FDA. It is completely unreasonable to think that one organization is going to be able to complete that task. That's just reckless behavior on your own part. To think that you can outsource the diligence of what you're consuming, you're a fool. You can't. You have to take responsibility, right? And to think, oh, don't worry, they've got my back. It's just an unrealistic and unfair ask. Now, look, I'm not saying they're innocent of any wrongdoing and lobby money influence and all of it, but simultaneously, it's like, it's your life, man. Like, it's up to you, and that's great news when you understand that nobody's got your back. It's like the best news ever, because then you realize, oh, I'm actually the one in the driver's seat. I've got full control. It's liberating.
Absolutely. And so many are willing to outsource that power, the thought, the decision-making process where you're having to use your own judgment. So many are willing to outsource that to quote unquote authorities. And I think, what we're talking about here, one of the appeals to gold and silver as money is that it reduces the trust required in the US dollar, right? I don't need to trust politicians to act in my best interest. I don't need to trust that an unelected cabal of bureaucrats that is the Federal Reserve will act responsibly or diligently. That's the beauty of gold and silver. That's the beauty of reducing trust in these institutions. I certainly don't trust these authorities, but an ideal money would make it to where I wouldn't have to.
Agreed. And it's, it's, again, I pull back to the same parallel, but I feel the same way about the food supply. And I think it's such an easy, parallel. It is just an easy parallel for me. It's like, okay, so I know we got to wrap up, but I wanted to just take a minute before we do, because if any of you watching are, college-aged viewers, or maybe your kids are, maybe your grandkids are, JP and his team have put together a scholarship called the Sound Money Scholarship. So I want you to take a minute, JP, and I'll have the link. It's right beneath. The link for this will be right beneath, but you write an essay, you qualify for some money. It's great. And you're putting your money where your mouth is in terms of promoting good values. So speak to the Sound Money Scholarship for a minute, JP. I'd love that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we've teamed up, the Sound Money Defense League teamed up with Money Metals Exchange 8 years ago to establish this scholarship where we put aside 100 ounces of gold. So that was at the time probably about $200,000. That has increased since, obviously, but we've put aside that money to fund excellent students who understand free markets and the Austrian idea of sound money. So this is, I think I mentioned, our 8th year. Every year we get a blue ribbon panel of academics and entrepreneurs and people in this space to judge the quality content that the contestants are submitting. Last year, we had over 150 applications from more than a dozen countries. So this year, we have a number of academics that are associated with the Mises Institute or that are associated with universities here in the United States. And the questions are online. You answer one of those questions, submit an essay. And this is, one of the projects we've been very excited about to do for 8 years. Because like you mentioned, there isn't, as far as I believe that sound money is incredibly important. I believe that I benefit a lot from a thorough and robust economic understanding. And unfortunately, we're seeing these college kids come out and they're closer to the left more and more. We're seeing more Marxist economists coming out of these universities than we've seen in a long time. And so in order to celebrate and to elevate students that have a good fundamental understanding of free market economics, we've established this scholarship and we're very excited to give it away again this year.
Hell yeah. I love that, JP. Congratulations on that, by the way. And hit that link beneath this video, guys. If you're a college age viewer, if you have college age kids, grandkids, this is a great deal. Hit the link below, walk through the steps. JP, appreciate your contribution. Look, man, so good chatting with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I feel like we could jam for another hour. So got to have you back sometime soon.
Sounds good, man. Jay, it's good seeing you again. Hope to see you again soon. And thank you for having me on.
Okay, man.